This session will focus on financing green, which is really about how do we drive the investment we need in the technologies and infrastructure we require to deliver our carbon targets and to deliver a net zero economy. And just to say a little bit about what that means in the UK, in the power sector, we're looking at potentially doubling the amount of generation we need and quadrupling the amount of low carbon generation. In cars, we might need 40 million plus low carbon vehicles. In buildings, we're going to need to decarbonise 30 million buildings with energy efficiency and low carbon heating, and we've got 30 years to do it, so you can do the maths. And we're not doing 1 million a year at the moment, it is safe to say. And then we've also got whole new infrastructure sectors like potentially CCUS and low carbon hydrogen. And what all that adds up to is an enormous investment challenge that it's going to be incumbent on all of us in this room to step up to help deliver. So I'm very excited about this session for two reasons. The first is, I think a first for me, I get to ask the questions rather than have to sit on a panel and answer them. So that's very enjoyable. The second is, I'm sure we all, in our idle moments, design our fantasy green finance panel. And if I were to design my fantasy green finance panel, I would probably come up with something very close to what we have here today. So first of all, to introduce Emma Howard-Boyd. Now, earlier I showed a sort of diagram about UK's expertise in finance and UK's expertise in environment policy, and if we were to put someone in the middle of that, we'd probably have Emma there, given her background, first of all with 25 years experience in financial services, and also her multiple roles now, including chair of the Environment Agency on the DEFRA board, and working also with the GFI. Secondly, we have Rhian-Mari Thomas, who is, I think, probably unique in having an OBE for services to green banking. Is that right? I think you might be the only. It's something we can all aspire to over the coming years. Hopefully there'll be many more. So Rhian-Mari is, as many of you will know, the chief executive of the newly formed Green Finance Institute, which is being funded by the government and by the City of London Corporation, and she has a very extensive background in green finance, both from her time at Barclays and also in her role on the Green Finance Task Force. And then last but not least, Nick Mabey at the end, the chief founder-director of E3G, and Nick again brings a wealth of experience from his background, both in government, I think in the PM strategy unit some years ago, in the Foreign Office, also in the NGO sector, working with WWF, and also in the electricity sector as well. And I guess one of the leading global experts on what the transition to sustainable development and to a low-carbon world looks like. So I'm sure you'll join me in welcoming the panel members. So I'll ask them a few questions to begin with, and then we'll open up, as we did earlier, for some questions for the floor. So I turn to you first, Emma, with the introductory question, which is really for the people in the room. What's the most important thing for policymakers to understand when we're thinking about how to meet the challenge of financing our environmental goals?
Well, thank you for the question. Thank you for the introduction. Just a little bit about the Environment Agency here in the UK. We are the environmental regulator, and we also have responsibility for flood and coastal erosion risk management in England. So I think what that brings to this discussion is very much the real economy piece, because we have members of staff up and down the country working at a local level on the environmental agenda and looking at the physical risks of climate change. In addition to sitting on the board of DEFRA, I am the UK's Commissioner on the Global Commission on Adaptation, and I was delighted when I was appointed to that role, because this was bringing together a group of leaders across the world, putting adaptation and resilience to the physical risks of climate change right on the global stage. It's chaired by Ban Ki-moon, Bill Gates, and Kristalina Georgieva, who has just started her role at the IMF. So again, a really brilliant way to make sure that when we are discussing climate change, we're remembering to think about the physical risks of climate and the important role that nature plays in some of the infrastructure decisions that we're going to need to put in place. I was also part of the Green Finance Task Force and was really pleased to be part of that, to bring again the adaptation, resilience and nature discussion alongside a couple of other individuals to make sure that we weren't just thinking about financing the clean growth strategy. And so one of the key points I want to make is A lot of the discussion so far has been about carbon, but it's about other aspects as well. It's about water, too much and too little, and it's about nature. And we've heard about the range of different ways that our planet is meeting its physical boundaries, and biodiversity is very much part of that piece and needs to be woven into the discussions that we're having around finance. So the most important thing I think policymakers need to understand is that preparing for the now inevitable impacts of the climate emergency is an essential part of our net zero goals. There is no point in building an energy efficient house that could be washed away in a flood, or a solar farm that could melt in a heat wave. And I think as we look at the current government's spending review and the flood budget for that, when I've calculated it, is roughly about 1%. If we look at our current infrastructure spend in the UK, and then we look at our influence around the world, we need to be thinking about how we are building that towards meeting our net zero goals, but also thinking about the physical risks of climate change and how we are making those investments resilient. And again, I want to emphasize the importance of, it's not just concrete, but if we're doing this properly for our country, but around the world, we need to be really thinking very clearly about nature as well. Domestically, the National Audit Office says for every £1 spent on protecting communities from flooding, around £9 in property damages and wider impacts is avoided. And globally, economic losses from disasters are already estimated at $520 billion a year. Last month, and I carry it around, this is one of my props that I take to a lot of the events that I speak about, that last month the Global Commission on Adaptation released this report, Adapt Now, a global call for leadership on climate resilience. And one of the key findings in that is that by investing $1.9 trillion in adaptation efforts globally from 2020 to 2030, it would guarantee $7 trillion in total net benefits. So the next 10 years is absolutely key for us to lock in how we meet our net zero targets and start thinking about that, but how we lock in resilience and adaptation. Because we've talked about stranded assets in the context of a transition to a low carbon economy, but I think we also have to think about the stranded assets as flooded assets or melting assets and the other physical risks of climate change. Working with the Global Commission on Adaptation gave me a huge opportunity to work with other departments, so closely with BEIS, but also, and importantly, DFID. And it's really interesting that now in our current government, we have a joint minister, Zach Goldsmith, who faces into DEFRA, but also faces into the Department of International Development. And what I'm really pleased about this event is across the public sector, across government, we have a huge opportunity to join up the dots. So very quickly, I know we've got colleagues from DEFRA here. Could you stick up your hands? Because I think I want other people from other departments to meet with them later on, and again, the Environment Agency as well. This is a huge opportunity to join the dots in terms of the thinking and our preparation for all that is needed in the next 10 years. One of the things that the UK government worked on and was announced at the UN was the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. And this is where the UK government, working with Egypt, working with the Global Commission on Adaptation, working with the private sector, so an initiative led by Willis Towers Watson involving the World Economic Forum, E3G have been involved as well, brought together a group of private and public sector players absolutely wanting to embed climate risk into the way they manage their investments, but also importantly, price risks. We have 5 trillion assets aligned and signed up to that initiative, and the ambition that John Haley, the chief executive of Willis Towers Watson, expressed out in New York was trebling assets aligned to the Coalition for Responsible Investment. I forgot to mention the Green Finance Institute is also very much involved in this, by COP25. So again, this ability for government to work alongside the private sector and really embed this in the way that we are moving forward. Again, a really important announcement that our Prime Minister made out at the UN, doubling climate finance through our international development budgets to 11.6 billion over the next 5 years, and very much looking at that being both adaptation and mitigation, and really thinking through how that sort of investment strategy is integrated. I've got so much more that I could talk about. I've touched on the role of the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. I think I also want to talk a little bit about the private sector as well. And Emily, you were talking at an event on, I think it was Monday evening, that WWF hosted. And the final speaker there was Jeremy Darroch, who is the chief executive of Sky. And I was really struck by the words that he spoke. When a business leader is frustrated at the disruption caused by Extinction Rebellion, or they find that extreme weather is making it hard for their business to operate, they shouldn't only look to government to solve the problem. It is our responsibility, so this is a significant business leader saying this, it is our responsibility to, indeed the future of our businesses, and more importantly, our planet, depends on it. So whilst there is a huge role, and I've crossed from the private sector into the public sector, I still have some private sector roles. Whilst there is a huge role to play in terms of the policy that is required, there is also a huge role to play in leadership. And that's why I, as chair of the Environment Agency, was really pleased last week when we, in our small way, made a step forward, which was announcing our own commitment to reach net zero by 2030. We've had a fantastic response to that commitment, not least from the people that we are working with in the private sector who work with us to build flood schemes, because this has now encouraged them to think about how they work with us to deliver on that net zero target. And it was great hearing Tom earlier from Treasury talk about pilots across government that can go ahead and start working on these new ways of working, because this is significant change. And again, I'm very proud that in the Environment Agency we're in a position to be able to do that across the range of work that we are involved with. Perhaps later I'll talk a little bit about the work of the Environment Agency Pension Fund as well. Thank you. Excellent.
Thank you, Emma. So I think a really important point there for all of us about the importance of the climate adaptation and resilience agenda alongside the mitigation one, which I tend to focus on. Nick, same question to you. What's the one thing for us to be thinking about when we're trying to meet the challenge of financing our goals?
Thanks, and thanks for it's brilliant to see such a packed out room that could probably been much larger, and hopefully will be much larger the next time this conference is held, because I think, and particularly the public part of it, there's been a lot of discussion about the private sector. I want to pivot a bit to the public sector. I want to say, for those of you who don't know E3G, we're a think tank. We work across Europe and also globally. You might know us as the people behind the UK Green Investment Bank, and we work a lot with UK cities, but also we've worked on green financing issues with China, South Africa, across the EU, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, just doing a lot of work in Southeast Asia. So we've got quite a lot of exposure to the issues around the world of getting enough green out of the door, and I think everybody, numbers were said earlier, is struggling to get enough green out of the door. But I think the first fact I want people to remember is that most of the infrastructure in our societies was built by public money or publicly guaranteed money, including in the UK. And that's just the state of play. And actually, the solving climate change would direct cost around 2% of GDP. Most OECD governments spend 40, low-end UK, 60, high-end Nordics of GDP on public goods. So it's not that it's unaffordable with public money, It's just that we may want to crowd in public-private money more sensibly, and that is the UK government's position, as the UK government has scrapped public-private partnerships for review in order to decide what's the best form of financing for different types of infrastructure. So I think that issue of a kind of being relatively agnostic about where the money comes from, understanding constraints, but realizing that in the end the public sector is responsible for delivering public goods, and it's going to be the driver here. And that leads me to three core principles, which are around climate change, which makes it different to normal kind of public-private partnership spaces for finance. Firstly, we need to meet speed and urgency to meet our goals. You know, going slow is failing, which is not like any other public sector area I've worked in. And that speed is faster than markets and the public sector want to change kind of naturally. We're going to generational turnover. And that was one of the main reasons we motivated the Green Investment Bank. We need to do things faster than people want to move. So that's the first principle. Second, to do that, we're going to have to intervene to grow, scale, shift, transform markets and investment in the public sector quite radically. And so we need to think about that. And that intervention, we should have an ideological problem with intervention. We've got a public good to deliver. We've got to follow the science, as Greta always says. Work back from the science, work out how fast we've got to shift, work out how to do that in the best way possible, not only if it doesn't breach some kind of idea of state to market interface. That's a secondary goal, that balance, not the primary goal, which is climate safety. And that leads to the last point is lots of people think putting new data down old pipes, whether those pipes are cost-benefit analysis in the Treasury and infrastructure or project assessment in infrastructure providers or asset management, that's going to change. It's not. It's much more fundamental, the reforms we need, and we need to think about this as a reform agenda, not a kind of marginal shift at the edge of pricing. And that is based on our experience everywhere in the world, in every sector, because we work across the whole economy. And that leads me to kind of three suggestions for what we should do. Firstly, you need a net zero financing strategy. And that has very simple steps. We did this all for the Green Investment Bank in the UK 3 times, market testing it. Firstly, what needs to change in the real economy? Simple. Secondly, who is going to deliver those new things? Because delivering a power station, a pipeline for fossil fuels is very different to delivering energy efficiency or distributed renewables. The who, and this is critical, who is it? A company? Is it a city? Is it citizens? Is it cooperatives? Really important. Finally, who finances those type of people? What are their constraints? What's their balance sheets? What kind of risk can they take? What's the price of money to them? And that then gives you a landscape that shows where the gap is. And when we did this for the UK, we found 80% of what was then the UK's target, and this is to 2030, had no obvious financing source because the utilities didn't have the balance sheets and the other people who needed to work on it weren't there. And that's because we have to shift to novel things. So half of the UK's 2030 investment is in energy efficiency, and there are no at-scale energy efficiency retrofit providers out there to raise money on the markets. So you've have companies who are new or novel, growing with new technologies and customers and no track record to go into a financial model. And that's true for nature-based solutions, it's true for urban resilience, it's true for just transition, it's true for charging networks, it's true for storage and smart. The vast majority of where the investment has to go is new, novel, and untested in the market. So someone has to be the person who does that and get money, and it's very unlikely that those are going to be large corporations that already exist with strong balance sheets. And I think a lot more of them are going to be cities and SMEs and cooperatives. And we see that. I work in London a lot with the mayor about the role of London on this, but also around the world we're seeing particularly cities being the place where this all comes together. So that's the first one. Have a plan, understand who's the who, how they raise money. That tends to move to the fact we need to have innovative, new or reformed public finance institutions to support those people. Because basically, even though they crowd in a lot of private money through green bonds, through direct debt, and the EIB is the largest development bank in the world, it's got a AAA rating, it raises huge amounts of bonds on private market for institutional investors. That's private money going through a public institution, but that's still private capital, savers' capital. But what we found is that we need specialist either green banks or green banking sectors. So the EIB has been asked to become a climate bank in Europe. 50% of its lending to be on climate change focused assets by 2025. And that needs various new skills. It needs ability to grow and engage with project pipelines. It needs specialist sector instruments and knowledge. It needs the ability to do market development and take first-scale risk. It needs aggregation. It needs political risk management. And you're seeing institutions of this grow everywhere. The UK had a green investment bank, then privatised it. Mistake in my view. The Scots have just set up a Scottish National Infrastructure Bank with a complete focus on green. South Africa set up a bank. China's building a bank. Mongolia, Philippines, Indonesia. All these people are starting to develop green banks. All over the US there are green banks because otherwise the money doesn't move. And that is the process by which we match the private money that's not earning enough money in our savings accounts or our pensions to these opportunities. And seeing where the EIB is going, so it's been asked to do 50% into climate from 2025, world's largest bank. It's also got extra risk capital allocated by the Commission to allow it to do riskier projects. It's got a new project development hub that means it can lean into new sectors and new areas. And it's also linking now to instruments which combine other forms of funding, particularly around coal transition regions across Europe, to do just transition regional development. So a lot of innovation out there, and I think that's really exciting. And with the UK reconsidering a national infrastructure bank, we've got a chance to design something really powerful. And all international development banks have committed to do this type of work, align with Paris. And COP26 is going to be a big moment for them to come together. So for me, those public, and they come in a variety of forms depending on the country, but they will do kind of the same job. Institutions are critical for building the green finance. But there's a hitch. To do that, they need permissions and support from finance and economic ministries. And that's my last point. And they're not there. So even when we have a good sector, we're running out of scale. So we need more capital in EIB to spend on green, because it's running out of capital. And that's a choice for economic finance ministries who have to take the risk on their balance sheets. We also need economic and finance ministries to reform how we plan, regulate, and manage markets and infrastructure, because our infrastructure is completely changing as it converges. We get rid of fuels and we go into convergence between transport, heat, power, storage, resilience, data. No one's talked about digital. There's a real gain, economic gain to be there, but it's not going to be the energy ministry who decides that. It's going to be the economics ministry. But that's a medium to long-term game to get those markets right and those structures right. In the meantime, we need these permissions for our public institutions. And UK is the most centralised country in the G20, just pips Turkey, or rather England is the most centralised country in terms of infrastructure spend. We need to give cities the freedom to borrow and invest on these issues with the right supervision. We need to have banks to support them with good credit. There's a whole financial system we need to do. That requires Treasury to make decisions to allow risk to happen. And at the moment, the Treasury thinks climate change is an externality. It's not on its balance sheet. The costs of climate change are not on the Treasury's balance sheet. So when it spends money on the Environment Agency to stop flood, it does not show up in its macro forecast as a saving. Those savings are off balance sheet. So unsurprisingly, our resilience spend is capital constrained by the pot of public money. It'll put money into roads rather than flood defence. That's a decision made this year. So how do we get that? And the good thing is that's moving. So there's a group called the Helsinki Group of Finance Ministers. There's 60 finance ministers, started in April this year. It's led by the Chileans and by the Finns. And they've agreed 6 principles, and one of them is to incorporate climate risk into public budgeting. And the UK has committed to stress test forward fiscal forecasts against climate risk. And that's good, because that shows if you don't solve this problem, if we have climate policy failure, it costs money. Taxes go up to pay liabilities. And hopefully that means the very small amounts of incremental risk you need to put on the public balance sheet to support new green finance, interesting institutions, new public-private partnerships, will look very small compared to the other contingent liabilities and costs which are on the balance sheet, allowing the right choices. So only when the macroeconomic implications of climate change are in the budget will we get the right public partner to private finance to make this work. My hope is by the early 2020s, every economic minister and finance minister will think a good transition plan, a good resilience plan means they get more and cheaper money from the markets, from their bonds, and that's where the credit rating agencies and others are coming in. And this is where TCFD comes back into the public sector, where the private sector will demand to know its investments in countries are well managed, the bits they can't manage themselves. And I think that's one of the big things we can all do around COP26 is accelerate that process of building good public finance institutions, innovative financing approaches to get the green finance opportunities for the private sector money to flow into, and drive the reform in public sector finance and economics, which will give permission to scale up and do that. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Nick. Rhian-Mari, same question to you.
Thanks ever so much, Tim. I'm going to keep this pretty brief. Having spent 20 years working at Barclays, so in the private sector, and having just spent 3 and a bit months working at the interface between policy and the private sector, my observation is this. The most important thing for policymakers to realise about green finance is that it is just finance. I don't mean that in a sort of aspirational statement kind of way. I mean it as a reality check. Green finance and the torrents of money that is now flowing towards ESG alignment, so the 90 trillion that have signed up to the UN Principles for Responsible Investing, or the 30 trillion that is now in ESG aligned funds, it is, those investors are still credit investors. They are still looking at the same traditional risk and reward models that they've looked at perpetually. So what that means is when I sometimes speak to policymakers, there's a tendency on occasion to talk about finance like a great big monolithic blob of money. So for the example, like when we talk about the 27 million homes that Tim mentioned earlier in the UK that we need to retrofit, they're currently responsible for between 15 and 20% of our greenhouse gases. The sorts of money that's going to be attracted to investing in energy efficient home software and some of the technology, that looks like venture cap. And the sort of money that will be the risk reward of the money that needs to go towards people that have mortgages or people that have repaid their mortgages, that's a very, very different conversation and a very different partner. As much as I love Daniel Clear at HSBC, there's very little point going to talk to him or his colleagues about venture capital proposals. So I think that's, my point is that the way the finance market works, it's a complex spectrum of risk and reward and tenor. So I guess I'm building on your points, Nick, and helping policy providers and policy makers identify the right buckets of risk and reward has to be the role of the private sector. And one of the things that I would encourage everybody to do is to involve the private sector, the banks, the insurers, the asset managers, very early in your conversations. Co-create your policies, co-create your ideas. I know that the city here in London can talk a lot of jargon and it can seem very intimidating, but none of us has been through a net zero carbon transition before, and so no one does have the monopoly of wisdom on this. And so it can sound very impressive when you're speaking to somebody that has a 20-year banking career and they throw a load of jargon at you, but actually they probably don't know that much more than any of us in the room about how we're going to do this. So we need to create the safe spaces to ask the questions and bridge the language gap, and actually, bring in not just the financiers and the policymakers, but the scientists, and also bring in the real economy actors. So if we're going to look at how do we build zero carbon homes and retrofit the housing that we have, let's speak to the people who are going to need to have that expertise so that we can figure out what they need in order to finance them. It's got one anecdote that I keep saying, so I really hope it's true, is that I was told that in Holland, in the Netherlands, they were looking at how to finance resilience to do with seismic shifts. And so they got a famous infrastructure organization to look at that, and they started tracking 120 different data variables and parameters. And then they went to speak to the financiers and said, look at all this great work we've done, we've provided you with all this transparent information. They said, that's great, we really only need to look at 6. And so that to me is such a fantastic example of how co-creating, given the urgency of what we have to do, we need to get everybody in the room up front, and that's certainly one of the roles that we have at the Green Finance Institute. And we can talk about that later, and I think it's certainly one of the roles that hopefully bringing everybody together today is something that is a small step in that direction.
Excellent, thank you. I think some really important points in response to that opening question, whether it's the importance, of, as I said, of the adaptation and resilience agenda and drawing the links across this portfolio of green finance. Secondly, around, and I think you're absolutely right, Nick, the critical role of public finance, public institutions in all of this, and in terms of catalysing these markets. And thirdly, the point, it is just finance. This has to be mainstreamed. And the importance, and I think a really important point about the opening up of conversations, the involvement in conversations. There's huge amounts of expertise on all the things we need to do, but no one's done it yet. And drawing in not just the financial services sector, but the real economy as well in terms of developing financing plans across all of our sectors is going to be critical. I'm just going to ask a couple more questions. I'm going to ask you to sort of stick to sort of 1 or 2 minutes for these, just to make sure we have time to take some questions from the audience as well. So Nick, we've obviously achieved a lot in the last 5 years. We haven't achieved as much as we need to, of course. What do you think the most important lessons of the last 5 years are for how we approach the financing challenge in front of us?
I think the first one, certainly from my time, moving from kind of relatively pure policy making and regulation to involving finance, was finance is not economics. And most policy making massively underestimates the role of risk in decision making. So we were designing markets in the power sector that produced massive amounts of risk and scared off smaller firms and drove particular market structures that were aligned with incumbents rather than new entrants. And that was why the move from a commodity price process to an auction process massively changed the risk side of reward. We also added some financial instruments in. But that issue of looking, as Rhian-Mari said, to the risk-reward structure, what markets are we driving with our policy? Who can come in and benefit from them? And are we excluding some of the actors we want in by kind of, in a sense, poor financial design? And who do we talk to do that? So the first one is we need to be more financially literate and baking from because what we're trying to do is market creation and transformation, which is different to product regulation, different thing. But the second one is how quickly finance drove transformation in the sector. So no one expected the German coal utilities to collapse in value as quickly as they did. The reason they did is we were looking at economic models, not at the way finance revalues the future value of firms. We went around to all the utilities, asked them if they were going to change their business model around 10 years ago, and only Vattenfall said yes. All the others, RWE and E.ON, said no, and then within 3 years they'd broken up into separate good firms, clean firms and dirty firms, because their business model was not credible to financial markets. So those are the two for me, literacy in understanding the impacts of policy on actually shaping markets, financeable markets, but also the incredible speed at which finance can multiply disruptive change and how it's generally catching us out. It's happening faster than we all think in the policy modelling community. So don't think with models, think with markets.
Excellent, thank you, Nick. And Rhian-Mari, you talked a bit about the point about how we engage with the private sector, how we engage with the financial services sector when we're developing policy frameworks and initiatives. In kind of more practical terms, what do you think the best way of us doing that is?
Yeah, I was going to ask the question, what is the most effective way of doing it? And there's a one-word answer, if we're going to be quick, and that is collaboration. And we've got a fantastic example in the UK. You mentioned earlier about offshore wind. 40% of global offshore wind capacity is installed around the British coastline. And when we look at that, and there's a fantastic OECD case study that is online and available for everyone to look at, to show exactly the interplay between the policymakers and the financiers in pulling that together. And actually now that is an industry that is fully supported by private capital, but it required seed funding from the Green Investment Bank, and it required contracts for difference in order to help get over some of the early investment barriers. And I think that is a real salutary example of how we can collaborate well. There's another area where I think private-public collaboration plays a key role in financing green, and that is in around actually creating smarter blended structures. So how do we, and it's something that you touched on, how do we create those special vehicles? We might want to call them banks, we might call them funds, whatever we want to call them, but where you're using government balance sheet as your cornerstone investment, and then you're actually structuring it in such a way that you are crowding in private capital. And using that money really wisely. And again, how are you going to do that? You're going to do that by collaborating and getting the smart structurers in the room and focusing very much on the outcomes that you want.
Thank you. And Emma, obviously this is a big transition in the UK, requires huge amounts of investment in the UK, but also globally. What do you think the best way is for us to try and make sure that we're capturing the kind of as much of that market as we can do?
So I would use the point around collaboration and partnership, but I would also use the point about pace and the fact that with the UK hosting the COP discussions in December next year, we've got this huge opportunity to mark out the key events, COP25 later this year, various events that will be happening where we can bring in the challenge of what are we actually doing. disclosure is incredibly important, but then we have to be doing something with that disclosure. I think also going on ahead and working at a local level. So again, we are really pleased that working with our department, DEFRA, working with cities, Manchester, other parts of the country, we are bringing together groups of people from local business, local government, civil society to start doing this stuff. So the Ignition project in Greater Manchester has received funding from Europe, is all about green infrastructure, and can we come up with the models today to just get on and do this thing. So using those deadlines, and again, I go back to the mantra, when I'm overwhelmed sometimes by the scale of what we have to do, I reduce it back to what are the things that I can do in my current roles today, and what are the actions that I can take with my colleagues to start moving this agenda forward. And the fact that we've got 15 months of deadlines and events to really encourage us to take action, we need to be making the most of that and bringing in our partners, different departments, the private sector, also the third sector, to just get cracking on this. And I think there's a huge lesson, was it Monday, Tuesday, we launched the Environment Bill, draft legislation. There's a lot that we have learnt from the Climate Change Act that will be in that, about embedding the work that we need to do in a legislative framework and making sure, again, we're joining up the dots across the range of things. It's not just carbon, it is water. When we're retrofitting those houses, we need to be thinking about water efficiency measures and the other things that we can be doing up the supply chain to send the signals that the whole of business needs to shift towards a net zero world, but also a resilient world too.
Excellent, thank you very much. Let me open up to the audience. Who would like to ask some questions of our panel?
Good afternoon. James Wiseman, I'm an advisor to the government on energy policy. A big thing for me is about system thinking, and there's an awful lot of investment on a case-by-case basis or a project-by-project. And in isolation, it may create benefits. However, looking at the energy system as a whole, ultimately, if we put all the investment in one area, and intermittency and other issues are prevalent, ultimately we're not getting the maximum benefit of that overall investment. So what I'm really trying to get at is how do we invest across a system as opposed to invest on a project-by-project basis?
Thank you. We had one more just down at the front, the lady at the front. Just here.
Thank you. Sarah Hayling from the Embassy in Rome. I just wanted to ask you about the circular economy, which is something that crops up a tremendous amount in Italy. I mean, also in the EU, that's the sort of the buzzword. But I haven't heard it here, and I wondered, if there's a reason for that and where you're coming from on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So system thinking and circular economy. Who'd like to take that one first?
Well, I'm happy to jump in,
Rhian-Mari.
because the two questions are kind of interlinked in a way, because the whole idea of financing a circular economy is about thinking in a broader system and not in this sort of traditional linear economic way. I think the short answer to your question, James, is the point that Nick was making about sector-specific vehicles that are focusing on channeling investments towards big outcomes and big challenges. So it's that traditional private sector organisations, they invest according to businesses or in a very linear fashion towards quite compartmentalised projects, as you say, or individual industries. And it's going to take quite a long time to break down that sort of organisational structure so that people are actually thinking in a far broader way. And the same challenge applies for circular economy. So the banks, for example, are in a fantastic position given that they do invest across such a broad sector of all the different industries across the economy to play that convening role. But actually there are deeply embedded incentives for them actually not to operate like that on a very human level. And so actually finding a way of focusing on a system or focusing on a part of the economy or the industry and actually having special vehicles that look at it. And I again come back to the offshore wind example, which was about creating an entire new ecosystem and an entire new set of economy around the UK. That was done because it was focused as a particular outcome. And I think that's what we're going to need, and that's going to need some quite bold policy leadership in order to do that, I think.
So we have some of the makings, if I can address the circular economy point, some of the makings of that in the Environment Bill. The government launched the Waste and Resources Strategy. The Environment Agency has been working very closely with DEFRA, the Department of Environment, on this area. We are the waste regulator in England, so it's very much on the top of my agenda in terms of dealing with the waste, but the signals that the Environment Bill, having worked quite closely also with the waste sector and those involved in thinking about financing that, are now part of where that bill will go. So again, it's this joining up of thinking at a very early stage. I worked with our former Environment Secretary, Michael Gove, where he brought in a group of businesses in the Council for Sustainable Business to work very closely at an early stage on some of these issues that feature in the 25-year Environment Plan, which is what's led to the Environment Bill. And the sooner we are joining up the dots, bringing in the private sector, bringing in the financiers to work out what are the signals that will start moving us in the right direction, the more likely it is we're going to send the whole economy in that direction. Obviously, that's very domestic, but again, I'm a great believer in recycling what we can learn from other parts of the world as well and bring that into our legislation and share that elsewhere.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the system integration. As I mentioned, I couldn't agree more in terms of the huge benefits. The more we look at how the multiple technological revolutions and kind of climate change impacts affect how we build infrastructure, and this is around the world and it's recognised around the world, the more we realise our current systems build the wrong future. They cannot build the right future because the way they're structured into stovepipes, driven by the 80s regulatory revolution in lots of countries, and that started here. It's where I started my career. And just a few kind of quick examples. So E3G works very much globally on pushing energy efficiency as an infrastructure option, which is now a UK policy. A good example, why practically, well, the size of the grid and the power system depends on the success of your energy efficiency in buildings and factories. The energy efficiency, remember we're going to have to build 10 new gas plants to meet the demand gap. Remember that? That was all killed by good fridges and mobile computing, cutting electricity demand. All of those power stations. Shows central planning doesn't work in a world going through that kind of multiple transitions. It's estimated that artificial intelligence can save or increase the capacity of the grid 20% by better using of assets, and it's probably more as we get a smarter grid. And the UK actually is moving towards, as elements are moving towards that kind of integrated infrastructure approach. The regulators network has been looking at integrated infrastructure, regulatory options, so you're actually looking at competition regulation and consumer regulation and network regulation rather than these stovepipes. I'm not sure it's got enough resilience in there yet. The National Infrastructure Commission is meant to produce a kind of integrated understanding of our infrastructure needs and how they interrelate, and there's a whole issue there on resilience and integration. And there is a big discussion about devolving to cities. So I think a lot of this comes together at the local level. We're too centralised, and the Bayes industrial strategy project, which we're involved in, called Prospering for a New Energy Revolution, is meant to be supporting experiments on integrated approaches at the local level, and Ofgem giving kind of sandbox regulation ability to do that. So, but those are all experiments at the moment. I think one of the big things, I think there's a huge economic prize as well as a necessity on climate change here. But are we doing a lot of patches, or are we going to do a fundamental reform to how we regulate, plan and fund infrastructure? Somebody's going to do the radical reform, and they're probably going to make a lot of money out of it and set the next economic paradigm. And it's a question, who's that going to be? The UK could do it, but are we too distracted by other things, you know what I mean, to do it at the moment? We exported the regulatory revolution of the 80s. Perhaps this is the next regulatory revolution we're going to export.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience?
Hi. I thought Rhian's point about the variation in risk culture in the private sector was really pertinent, and I was wondering if the panel had views on the role of the public sector in engaging what I would think were sometimes quite siloed areas within the private sector, building their capability, actually engaging them. I mean, we hear loads about green bonds, but if we're starting to get to private equity, VC, you can argue life insurance So what do you think the role of the public sector is in getting all the people on the risk spectrum involved in the private sector?
Thanks, I'm Sam Levy from Bays. Thinking about what Emma has been saying, I wonder whether there's sometimes a perceived conflict between investing in adaptation and investing in mitigation, and whether we need to be more clear that those things go hand in hand, and that investing in adaptation is not saying we're accepting that the world will warm, but that we need to do these things regardless of ambitious investment in mitigation.
Thank you. Who'd like to take those? Who'd like to go first on that?
Well, I'm very happy to go first on the last question. I think we do need to understand that the two go absolutely fundamentally hand in hand, and you don't have to look very far over recent weeks, or days, weeks, and months around the world to see that we are seeing massive incidents that I would argue are on the back of our changing climate, not just in the developing world, not just in the global south, but in developed economies. Take Japan, take Tokyo, just last weekend. And my son lives and works in Tokyo, so I was also sort of dealing with that as a mother. But the scale of that event, and I don't think I've yet seen any economic figures as to how the economy of Japan has been affected by that. They're also one of the countries that is the most prepared for typhoons. But some of the information I was receiving, because we work quite closely with the Japanese, was quite frightening in terms of the scale of water as well as wind and how that was damaging buildings, damaging infrastructure. And so it's kind of anywhere and everywhere. And we have to understand that despite all the action that we need to take in terms of reducing our emissions, climate risks are locked in for decades to come. And that's why I make this point, that we mustn't be investing in the stranded assets today of the future, because ultimately they become flooded or melted. So really key point. And I think that's something that I would like everybody in this audience to go away with. This is now. This is every decision you're making at a local level, at a global level, whatever type of investment structure that you're thinking about.
Thanks.
I'll go very quickly on this gentleman's question about the public sector's role in helping bridge all that risk-reward spectrum. It's a brilliant example of that here in the UK, of the Green Finance Task Force that was pulled together in 2017. Which really did do that. It brought together experts from right across the piece and came up with 35 different recommendations, one of which was to set up a Green Finance Institute, so I'm obviously a big fan. But more importantly, the reality, and I keep bringing it back to this very human dimension, the reality of sitting on a bond desk in one of the big banks. If you went to your boss and said, I've got this brilliant idea, I'm going to spend the next 6 months working with the insurance sector, working with policy think tanks, working with the environmental agency on figuring out how we create an entirely new asset class that will channel money into adaptation, which is very difficult to do because a coastal wall doesn't repay a monthly coupon, right? So that's very hard. You will get a very short answer to that question, right? But if there is an email that comes into the big boss saying, with ministerial backing, we are setting up a new coalition that's going to draw on the smartest minds across science, academia in the city, and we would like your employee and your organisation to be part of this for the next 6 months. That is the convening power that the public sector has, and it is very well received. And so that is my answer to that question. And very quickly on the adaptation one, I agree it's completely unhelpful when it is set up. It's almost in conflict to mitigation. But there is a reason why that is in financial services. It is a much easier business case to finance carbon mitigation because nearly all carbon efficiency projects end up with a P&L benefit because you're reducing emissions, you're reducing cost. Whereas adaptation is very difficult. Financing, not impossible, but it does require a different set of thinking. And for a lot of adaptation financing, it's got to do with monetizing avoided losses. So it's a very, I wrote down your stat earlier, Emma, about 1.9 trillion invested in adaptation globally could guarantee 7 trillion in net benefits. Unfortunately, that isn't always accrued in a direct way. So it could be my example of coastal wall, very quickly. You could build a coastal wall that protects the train line that brings the workers into the city, and that those workers maintain the productivity and the GDP of that city. So there is value created, but not directly by the coastal wall. And the way our financial services industry has worked is if you make a loan to the coastal wall, you want the coastal wall to pay you back. And so we do need smarter and different ways of thinking about how we monetize avoided losses and how we monetize value that is created further down the value chain.
Can I add to that? I know, Nick, you want to come in, but one of the things that has come out of TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosures, firstly this, where you're getting large asset managers or pension funds putting a figure on what degree warming they are investing in. So the example of the Japan fund earlier. The other thing that has come out of it is where you are getting individual companies talk about the additional capital expenditure that they may need to make in order to make individual facilities resilient to the physical risks of climate change. Again, if that means you've just got an office block or a facility resilient in situ and you can't actually get to it or get home from it, that is fundamentally failing. So again, we need to change our mindset around how we approach these things. Bloomberg as an organisation has put a 10% of additional capital expenditure on that, on what it needs to do, because it's experienced having its servers in the basement out in New York when a hurricane took place there. Again, Bloomberg needs to get together with the other organisations, businesses, local governments in the cities that it is present in and come up with a different way of thinking about funding resilience. It may mean that ultimately they pay less than that 10%, but because they've worked collaboratively and in partnership. And that is some of the early thinking that we're exploring in cities like Manchester and other places up and down the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as someone who's got most careers been in kind of energy and diplomacy and areas like that, moving into finance over the last 10 years, the really interesting piece for me was how few people understood the overview of the financial system across public, private, blended, and macroeconomics. I'm also a macroeconomist. And that made it really hard, because actually you need to move all bits of the system to kind of make it work. And I think that systemic knowledge, which we're starting to build it across the piece, is actually where government needs strong. And it was, actually because no one was trying to say, what's the financial industry for? What's the purpose of it? And that lack of a purpose-driven mission meant, unlike the energy system, other bits of the system, we didn't have that systems view. I think we're trying to make the overall financial system do something now, and it's causing a very different approach, and I think we're still getting up there. But one of the things we suggested at European level, UK, is we need an observatory to know where the money's going. Just very simple things. We don't know where the money is going, to whom, at what price. And that means we have gaps and people feel excluded, and money, for example, European money flows very well to the west of European green, but not to the east of Europe. It's not very good politics. And there's failures there. So just simple things like actually measuring everything properly from the public sector point of view would be really good. But I think that's a work in progress, and it is quite a fundamental mind shift about how the public sector relates to the financial industry. On the adaptation thing, again, I agree with everything that's being said, but also don't just think about this as a micro issue at project level. I think it's macro. So a few things. So on climate impact, Singapore, you may have noticed, just allocated a lot of money to adaptation. That's about, it's mostly reclaimed land in many places. But also Singapore is going to be killed by Arctic sea level ice melt. It's actually an observer on the Arctic Council. Why? Because it makes a lot of its money by being the port between China and Europe. And if the ships are going through the Arctic Circle, it loses its rationale for existing as an economic space. So Singapore-on-Thames, perhaps not the analogy after Brexit. If you're in the Caribbean and you want to rebuild your tourism industry, and TCFD is coming in and saying, you're too risky to invest in, you're experiencing massive capital flight, it's a macroeconomic issue for your development. The UK has a huge car industry. Unless it gets on the EV bandwagon, the UK is going to have a fundamental change from climate change in its overall economic performance. So one of my worries is on all adaptation, both the transition, as it's all very micro. It doesn't look up at some of these. We're changing the whole of the world economy in a few decades, it's going to make things different for people at that macro level. And again, because we're not playing the big picture, we don't get the big picture responses and the big picture decisions from politicians to solve those issues. We get little bits down here. And I think, again, this is one of the things we've got to move our eyes up a bit to the whole of economy rather than being stuck in the kind of policy stuff at the low level. And finance and economic ministries have got a huge role to play in that because they have that overview in the ways sectoral ministries don't. And that gives them an incredible different role to play in the transition.
I just wanted to pick up on the point you made at the beginning. And it's about this idea of giving a purpose to the financial services industry. And I think this is it's a huge opportunity for the financial services industry, actually, to align itself behind a real mission where we've embedded science into our decision-making and that we actually are able to be the enablers of this huge revolution that we need to see. And I think one of the triumphs of the green finance strategy, if I may, is this idea of financing green and greening finance, which sounds like semantics, but actually is worthy of really thinking about, because greening finance is about pivoting the financial services industry. It's about making sure the right incentives, the right governance, the right regulations are in place. But to my mind, the purpose of greening finance can only really be so that you are financing green. You are creating the supply conditions so that you then have the right engagement, the right products, and the right channels and the right funds to actually get that money. It has to be about the emissions, stupid. Right? It is not a triumph to say, oh, actually, more green bonds are now being issued in London than in Paris. That is not a triumph. That would be good. But it's, if we lose sight of what we're actually trying to do, which is turn finance into an enabler of the transition and a transition to a net zero and resilient economy, this is a huge opportunity, so let's not let it go to waste.
Excellent. Thank you all very much indeed. I'll ask you the question I always ask at the end of job interviews, which is there anything you wish you'd said but haven't had the opportunity to? in which case, I'm conscious we're at risk of starting to keep you from your lunch, but sorry, Emma.
I do want to make two little points, and that's to Nick talking about playing at the local level or playing on the global stage. I think we need to play on all of these. We really, really do. And it's been fascinating for me watching the way different governments have been getting behind the Global Commission on Adaptation. And the Dutch, we do a lot of work at the Environment Agency with our Dutch colleagues. Their leadership has been all over this initiative. And again, as we think of the work that we're doing around the world, I think we do need to be thinking more about the adaptation and resilience agenda and our role on trade missions. So it's not just green and low carbon, which is really, really important, but what can we do both domestically but globally on the water side of things. And then just a tiny little point, I think it was referred to very briefly in the previous panel on nature, the Dasgupta review. And again, we've got colleagues in DEFRA looking at how we learn from TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure, and how we use that sort of learning procedure to look at nature-based disclosure as well. So this is stuff, there's so much that is going on across different departments. We need to make sure that we are all understanding it across different parts of government and reaching out and working together as quickly as possible to make sure that we've got the best thinking going on this.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'm going to be really quick and make a point about that, making me very optimistic about the way the capital markets are moving on this at the moment, and that is about the these new transition bonds that are coming out. And I don't have time to go into it in enough detail, but I just think the green bonds that we've had for the last 10 years have really elevated the dialogue. They've really moved us forward. But now we need to be looking to finance strategies and entire businesses. And I think some of these transitions bonds that we're starting to see, and I would include in that things like the Enel bond that the Italian power generator came out with a couple of weeks ago, where basically if they don't increase the overall proportion of renewable energy in their overall portfolio by a certain amount over the next 5 years, they'll get a penalty on their coupon. They'll have to pay more for their cost of funds, 25 basis points. That was a €1.5 billion bond that came out to market, was heavily oversubscribed, and I think is moving this idea of way to the point that somebody was making earlier. It's moving away from use of proceeds and project to how do we transition entire businesses, and because it's the businesses that need to transition in order to transition the industries and the economy. So I'm happy to talk about that more over lunch, because I think it opens up a whole new and exciting asset class within capital markets.
Yeah, very simple. We've got an amazing opportunity, and the UK government wants to step up and, with UK other stakeholders, lead the world through COP26 to the G7, G20 in 2021, which is also a UK-Italy co-production. It's very interesting. There's a real opportunity to make a step change in reform across public and private and development banks and a whole range of areas. But to do that, the UK needs to do stuff at home, so it can actually talk the walk it's doing at home. We need a new spending round that actually doesn't put 40 billion into roads and a tiny squib into tree planting, but funds the net zero plan. We need a national infrastructure bank or something equivalent to actually get the money in there. We need to give particularly cities and towns the ability to finance and the control over money and revenues to build sustainable markets. And we need to stop our export credits funding fossil fuels, which we do too much of. And if we do those things in the first half of next year, we'll be in a position to shape the global conversation from a firm basis at home, rather than have a constant kind of undermining of our diplomatic position by misaligned policies.
Excellent. Thank you, and thank you all of our panellists. So just to conclude, I think a really stimulating session. A couple of very quick reflections from me. One is that this is a really exciting agenda for policymakers. It's also a really daunting agenda for policymakers when we're talking about the kind of scale of transition that we're talking about. But I think one of the things I would take from that is the mandate to do things differently, to be creative, to be bold, to co-create. And you might have seen that today the Prime Minister's announced he's setting up a new Cabinet Committee on climate change, and Cabinet Committees don't tend to want you to come and tell them that what happened in the past and that it's all fine. They tend to want to do new and exciting and innovative things. So I think we have a huge opportunity there. The second piece is that linked to that, and is the bit about collaboration and integration, both between the public and private sectors, and actually within the public sector, given in particular that we shouldn't underestimate the convening power and other forms of power and influence that we have. And there is no better way to collaborate than over lunch in the Great Hall, which is next door. So we will reconvene, I think, at 2. But thank you very much for this morning, and please say thanks to our excellent panel.